In the spring of 1872, the town of Reed Hollow, Alabama, woke to a silence that felt unnatural, as if the air itself refused to move. 11 white sheets hung from 11 porches, each one stained dark at the throat. Beneath them lay the bodies of men who had ruled the night with fire and rope, 11 leaders of the Ku Klux Klan. The sheriff called it vengeance. The preacher called it divine punishment. But the townspeople whispered another name, one they never spoke above a murmur: the Black Widow. No one knew who she was. Some said she had been a slave whose family was slaughtered by masked riders. Others claimed she was a soldier's widow who had lost her mind after watching her husband hang from a tree. But all agreed that every man who shared her bed was found the next morning, throat cut clean, the bedsheets turned red. Fear spread through Reed Hollow like rot through old wood. The men who once hunted others now locked their doors at night. The women crossed themselves when her name was spoken. And when a 12th bed was found neatly made, untouched, and waiting, the town understood one thing: she wasn't finished. Before she became the whispered curse of Reed Hollow, she had another name: Evelyn Harrow. Born in 1846 on the edge of the Alabama River, she was the daughter of a plantation overseer and a woman who was never allowed to speak her past. Her mother's skin carried the faint bronze of somewhere foreign, and her eyes held the quiet sorrow of someone who knew too much. When Evelyn was 16, she watched her world burn. Her father vanished during the last months of the Civil War, leaving behind only a ring and a debt to men who would later wear white hoods. Her mother was taken one night, accused of witchcraft, after she was seen burying jars near the riverbank. The next morning, Evelyn found her body hanging from a cypress tree, hands bound, eyes still open. Something inside her broke that day, but not in the way grief breaks people. It was quieter, like a candle going out in a locked room. She took her mother's ring, the buried jars, and disappeared into the swamp. For 7 years, no one saw her. But there were stories of a woman living deep among the mangroves, speaking to the river, never aging, never sleeping. Some said she had made a pact. Others said the river had chosen her. When she returned to Reed Hollow in 1872, she wasn't Evelyn Harrow anymore. She was the shadow of everything the town had tried to forget. Reed Hollow was a place that pretended history could be buried. The streets were lined with whitewashed houses, their porches polished, their flags always clean. But beneath the neat fences and Sunday hymns, the soil was dark, not from the river's mud, but from the blood it had soaked for generations. After the war, the town had rebuilt itself on fear and silence. Former soldiers became sheriffs. Overseers became judges. The men who once hunted slaves beneath the moonlight now led sermons in daylight, preaching forgiveness while wearing the same eyes that once watched men die. No one spoke of the burned fields at the edge of town. No one spoke of the missing families, the nameless graves by the river. Those things were erased, like chalk washed from a board, except by the few who remembered, and by one woman who refused to forget. When Evelyn Harrow returned, Reed Hollow didn't recognize her. She came dressed in black, with a small silver cross and a scar running along her jaw. She took a room at the edge of town, above the old apothecary, and spoke to no one. But the men noticed her. The ones who still met in secret barns at night, the ones who thought their sins were safely buried, noticed her most of all. And one by one, she let them. The first man was Deputy Samuel Griggs, 39, a husband, a father, and the quiet organizer of Reed Hollow's Night Riders. He met her by accident, or so he believed, when she came to report a stolen locket. Her voice was low, her gaze unwavering, and her story simple. Someone had taken what once belonged to her mother. Samuel promised to help, though he never meant to. What he wanted was something else. In a town that worshipped appearances, he saw in her a kind of forbidden purity, a mystery wrapped in grief. And when she touched his arm, lightly, he forgot to breathe. They met again a week later, in the upstairs room of the old mill. She told him about dreams, dreams of a river that whispered names, of men drowning while white linen floated above them like wings. He laughed, called her strange, called her beautiful. She smiled and told him she already knew his name. That night, he didn't go home. In the morning, a farmer found his horse tied outside the mill, still saddled. Inside, Samuel lay on the bed, eyes wide open, his throat slit so deep that the pillow was soaked through. There were no signs of struggle. Only one thing was found on the nightstand: a silver ring with a black thread wrapped tightly around it. The sheriff called it murder. The preacher called it sin. But the townspeople said quietly, "The widow has begun." Reed Hollow had its own order long before the Black Widow's return. By 1872, the Knights of the Pale Flame, a local branch of the Ku Klux Klan, had become something more than a political brotherhood. They were a covenant of power, binding the richest and most feared men in Alabama's backcountry under the illusion of divine purpose. By day, they wore respectability like armor. The mayor, the reverend, the doctor, the sheriff, all members. By night, they gathered in a barn outside town, their faces hidden, their words recited in a mockery of scripture. They burned effigies, punished the ungrateful, and swore oaths in blood. They believed themselves untouchable. When Deputy Griggs died, they met in panic. 11 of them, the inner circle, all bound by a single secret: the murder of a man named Caleb Harrow, a Union soldier accused of treason in 1865. They had hanged him on the outskirts of town and buried his body under an oak tree with no marker. Caleb Harrow had been Evelyn's husband. None of the 11 knew her name. None remembered the young woman who'd screamed at their feet as her husband's body swung from the branch. They had forgotten her face, her voice, her grief. But she had not forgotten theirs. And now, one by one, she was coming for them, not as the broken widow they left behind, but as something their prayers could no longer reach. After her mother's death, Evelyn vanished into the swamps. People said she had gone mad. But those who lived near the river told other stories, of strange lights seen moving beneath the water, of a woman's voice humming lullabies in languages no one recognized. Deep in those marshes, Evelyn found something the town had forgotten. Beneath the cypress roots, buried in black silt, were her mother's jars, glass containers sealed with wax and bound by rope. Inside each was a symbol written in red clay, a lock of hair, and a name scratched into the glass. She opened the first jar and whispered her mother's name. The air around her changed. The frogs went silent. The river rose. And from that moment, she was no longer alone. The stories that followed were never written down. Some said she made a pact with the river itself, that it gave her back what the world had taken: its patience, its hunger, its quiet power. Others swore she had learned her mother's old craft, the language of vengeance older than scripture. Whatever the truth was, Evelyn came out of the swamp with eyes like still water, cold, reflective, endless. She carried the jars with her when she returned to Reed Hollow. Each one held a name. Each name belonged to a man who had buried her past beneath a tree. She called it the river's gift, a gift that always demanded something in return. The second man was Reverend Josiah Harlan, a preacher who spoke of righteousness by day and commanded hatred by night. He had been one of the men beneath the hood, the one who tied the noose around Caleb Harrow's neck. When Evelyn returned to town, he was the first to greet her in church, smiling with the practiced warmth of a man who believed his sins had long since been buried beneath holy words. She sat in the back pew that morning, her black veil drawn low, her hands folded quietly on her lap. When his sermon ended, he found a folded note on the pulpit. "You speak of salvation, Reverend. But tell me, how do you wash blood from the roots of a tree?" That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept seeing her eyes in the dark, those calm, unblinking eyes that seemed to see straight through the cross above his bed. The next morning, the church doors were found open. Inside, the air smelled of candle wax and iron. Harlan was kneeling at the altar, head bowed as if in prayer. His Bible lay open in front of him, turned to the Book of Lamentations. His throat had been opened in one clean stroke, and his tongue had been cut out and placed on the page. The townspeople said nothing, but the whispers spread. She wasn't just killing them. She was taking back something they had stolen, and 11 jars still remained unopened. After the Reverend's death, Reed Hollow began to rot from the inside. The church bells stopped ringing. Families locked their doors before sunset. Men who once strutted through the streets with rifles now walked with eyes over their shoulders, afraid of every rustle, every shadow. The remaining 9 in the secret circle met in silence. They burned their hoods, destroyed their ledgers, and swore new oaths of secrecy. But guilt is a noise that never truly fades. It whispers through walls, crawls through dreams, and grows louder with fear. The sheriff ordered a curfew, but no law could stop what had already begun. Chickens were found dead in their coops, their necks cleanly severed. Blood appeared on doorsteps without footprints. Children swore they saw a woman standing by the river at dusk, her black dress floating like smoke. Some said it was the widow herself. Others said it was something wearing her face. The doctor who examined the reverend's body claimed he had seen her once before, years earlier, when she came begging for medicine the night her husband was lynched. There was a mark on her wrist, he said, like something had burned her there, something that wasn't fire. By then, Reed Hollow's men stopped talking justice and started talking curses. They prayed in secret, begged the preacher's assistant to bless their homes. But the widow was not hunting homes. She was hunting hearts. And every night, another one began to falter. Months after her return, the apothecary's landlord found something strange inside Evelyn Harrow's rented room. A small leather-bound book hidden beneath a loose floorboard. It was not a diary in the usual sense. There were no dates, no entries, only names, symbols, and passages written in a language that looked half English, half prayer. The first page read, "To remember is to keep them alive. To forgive is to let them die again." Each page after bore a man's name: Griggs, Harlan, Bishop, Cole, written in ink so dark it almost shimmered. Next to each was a single symbol, a spiral drawn counterclockwise, a circle split in two, a cross with a broken arm. These weren't drawings of hate or faith. They were instructions, rituals. At the back of the book, in delicate handwriting, were lines that unsettled even the sheriff who confiscated it. The river does not forget. It only waits. It remembers every secret buried in its mud, every lie whispered above its water. It keeps the shape of every throat that has ever drowned. No one knew where the journal came from, or who taught her to write it. But the townspeople whispered that the pages changed when you weren't looking, that new names appeared, written in fresh ink, as if the book itself knew who was next. That night, the sheriff locked it in his desk. By morning, the desk was empty. Sheriff Amos Burke had lived in Reed Hollow long enough to know that fear could be controlled, until the night he found the journal missing. He searched his office, his home, even the church, but the book was gone. That same evening, a note appeared nailed to his door. It bore no name, only a message written in red ink. "You buried the wrong man." Burke had once prided himself on his order, his law, his control. But beneath his calm authority, guilt festered. He remembered 1865, the rope, the firelight, the young widow screaming as her husband swung. He had been the one who gave the signal to pull the rope, the one who told her to let it be God's will. Now, every night, he heard a sound that wouldn't stop. Not footsteps, not knocking, dripping, slow, steady drops, like water leaking through a ceiling. He tore up his floorboards searching for the source, but found nothing, only the faint smell of river mud. By dawn, his house was empty. The deputies found him near the courthouse steps, sitting upright, eyes open, mouth filled with water. There was no wound, no sign of struggle, only the same black thread tied around his wrist, the mark the widow left behind. The preacher's assistant said it was suicide. The townspeople disagreed. They said the river had come for him. And now, Reed Hollow began to drown in its own silence. Dr. Nathaniel Cole was the man who had delivered most of Reed Hollow's children and buried most of its secrets. He was a quiet man, courteous, careful, but his hands had once done something they were never meant to do. In the spring of 1865, he had been summoned to the edge of town by the same men who would later wear hoods. They told him to sign a death certificate for a man who was still breathing, Caleb Harrow. When he refused, they broke his arm and forced him to watch. The next morning, his signature appeared on the paper anyway. Years later, he told himself he had only obeyed to survive. But when the Black Widow returned, that lie began to crumble. He saw her once in the marketplace, dressed in black, eyes calm, carrying a small bundle of herbs. She looked at him, not with hatred, but with recognition. That was worse. Soon after, strange things began to happen in his home. Medical instruments moved on their own. The smell of river water followed him from room to room. His reflection in the glass jars seemed to look elsewhere. One night, he found one of his own scalpels missing. The next morning, the maid discovered him in his study, slumped over the desk, his throat neatly cut, the missing scalpel still in his hand. On the blotter beneath his body were two words, written in blood. Forgive her. The townspeople wondered which her he meant, the widow or himself. By autumn of 1872, Reed Hollow had become a ghost of itself. Shops closed early, shutters stayed nailed, and the church pews grew emptier each Sunday. The townspeople whispered prayers they no longer believed, clutching rosaries and rifles alike. The deaths were no longer seen as coincidences or curses. They were judgments. But from whom? God, the devil, or the woman they had wronged? No one could agree. All they knew was that the river never stopped whispering, and every night its voice seemed closer. Men accused one another. Friends turned to enemies. The widow's name became a curse no one dared to speak after dark. A rumor began that she wasn't working alone, that the ghosts of the hanged men, the beaten and buried, were rising from the river to help her finish her work. The mayor ordered patrols, but no one volunteered. The few who did vanished before sunrise, their footprints leading toward the cypress swamps and ending in the water. Soon, fear began to eat its own. Wives poisoned husbands out of suspicion. Neighbors reported each other for witchcraft. A woman was beaten for having a scar on her wrist. Reed Hollow had once been proud of its order, its piety, its purity. Now, the town was devouring itself, one lie at a time. And through it all, Evelyn Harrow watched in silence from her upstairs window, the same calm, unblinking gaze as the river at night. The next name in Evelyn's hidden journal belonged to Silas Vance, son of Colonel Abram Vance, the man who had financed the secret order after the war. Silas was young, charming, and arrogant, the kind of man who thought the world owed him something simply for surviving it. He inherited his father's estate, his wealth, and his quiet hatred. He'd been only a boy the night Caleb Harrow was hanged, but he had carried the torch that lit the tree. It was a story he told proudly in whispered company, a family legacy of loyalty and strength. That pride curdled the night he met her. She came to him under the name Mrs. Ellis, saying she wished to sell herbs for medicine. He invited her in, smirking, already deciding what he'd do. But the moment she stepped through the door, the air changed, cold, thick, electric. He poured her a drink, but his hands trembled. She never touched hers. Later, his servants said they heard him laughing in his study, talking to someone who never answered. The next morning, the room was locked from the inside. When they broke it open, they found him slumped in the chair, his throat cut so deeply it looked like a second smile. The whiskey glass was still full. On the wall behind him, written in something dark and wet, were 4 words. The sons are guilty. And outside, the river swelled again. As the bodies multiplied, the town realized something no one wanted to say aloud. She wasn't hiding. She was waiting. And when the autumn rains came, Evelyn Harrow walked back to the river that had once taken everything from her. Those who saw her that night said she moved like she was following music only she could hear. Her black dress dragged through the mud. Her hands carried something wrapped in linen, and her bare feet left no prints. She walked straight into the water until it reached her waist, then knelt as if in prayer. By morning, she was gone. But on the riverbank, 11 small jars were found arranged in a circle. Each jar was filled with water, so dark it looked like ink. In the center of the circle was her mother's silver ring, still bound by that same black thread. The sheriff's replacement, a frightened young man named Poe, ordered the jars destroyed. But when one was dropped, the water inside hissed like oil on fire and vanished into the soil. That night, the 12th jar appeared at the apothecary, placed gently on Evelyn's windowsill. Inside was a name, Reed Hollow. The message was clear. The final offering wasn't meant for a man. It was meant for the town itself, for every lie, every silence, every prayer uttered to cover the sound of a rope tightening. And the river was ready to collect. On the night of November 12, 1872, the river broke its banks for the first time in 40 years. Rain fell in sheets so heavy it erased the horizon, and the Alabama sky turned the color of iron. The townspeople woke to the sound of rushing water and the church bell ringing without a hand to pull it. The flood came from the north, swallowing fields, barns, and fences. But as the current reached Reed Hollow, it slowed, as if something unseen was guiding it. It moved down the main street like a living thing, avoiding some houses, devouring others. At dawn, the water stilled. Those who dared to look out saw something that would haunt them forever. 11 white shapes floating gently in the current, each wrapped in a bedsheet, faces pale and still. The last of the Knights of the Pale Flame had been found. Some claim they saw Evelyn walking through the water, her dress rippling like smoke, her hands outstretched toward the bodies. Others swore she vanished when the church steeple collapsed, her veil sinking into the dark flood like a shadow returning home. When the river finally receded 3 days later, the land was scarred. Crops ruined. Homes gutted. The apothecary where she'd lived stood empty, its windows shattered, and written across the wall in streaks of mud was one sentence. The river remembers. No one ever saw her again, but Reed Hollow never stopped hearing her. When the floodwaters finally drained away, Reed Hollow was no longer a town. It was a wound that refused to close. Half its people were gone, swept into the river or vanished without trace. The courthouse collapsed, the church bell cracked, and the fields turned to black mud. Only the dead remained certain. Those who survived refused to speak her name. They buried the drowned in unmarked graves on the hill, but when morning came, the graves had sunken in, as if the ground itself rejected them. The preacher's assistant fled town. The blacksmith's wife went blind. Children were born still and silent for months afterward. In the center of what was once Main Street, a single jar was found, half buried in the silt. Inside it was a page from Evelyn Harrow's journal, miraculously dry. On it were written just 5 words. The river keeps its promises. Within a year, Reed Hollow was abandoned. Maps were redrawn, roads rerouted, and the name of the town slowly erased from county records. Travelers passing through spoke of strange lights seen over the old riverbed, and of voices humming when the night was quiet. Some said the river had claimed what was owed. Others believed it was still hungry. And deep beneath the cypress roots, where the current slows and the mud grows black, they say 11 jars still rest, sealed, waiting, patient as the woman who placed them there. Nearly 50 years after the flood, November 1921, a young journalist named Clara Hensley arrived in what remained of Reed Hollow. She had heard the stories, the missing town, the drowned men, the woman they called the Black Widow, and she wanted to uncover the truth for her newspaper in Birmingham. When she reached the site, there was little left but ruins and whispers. The streets were gone, swallowed by forest. The air smelled faintly of iron and wet moss. Locals in the nearby county warned her not to go near the old riverbed, claiming it didn't flow right. She went anyway. Clara carried a notebook and a camera. She camped near the cypress trees, documenting what she found: remnants of a church steeple, fragments of porcelain, a cracked apothecary sign. Then, one evening, while walking by the waterline, she noticed something glinting beneath the mud, a small glass jar, perfectly sealed. Inside was dark liquid and what looked like a folded piece of paper. Against every instinct, she opened it. The smell was overwhelming: mud, rot, and something faintly metallic. On the paper, in faded ink, were 2 words written in an elegant hand: "Welcome back." That night, Clara wrote frantically in her journal, describing voices outside her tent and the sound of dripping water, though the river was still. Her last entry ended abruptly mid-sentence. "She's standing." In the morning, her campsite was empty. The only thing found was her camera, half submerged in the shallows. The final photo showed a woman in black, standing where the river bends. When Clara Hensley's belongings were recovered, her camera was sent to the Birmingham Gazette office. The film roll inside was water-damaged, but still usable. The editor, curious and skeptical, sent it for development. What appeared in those photographs changed the course of the investigation and the sanity of everyone who saw them. The first few images were expected: old ruins, the riverbank, trees twisted by time. But as the sequence continued, something else appeared. In the background of nearly every frame was a faint silhouette, a woman in a long black dress, standing just at the edge of the frame. She was always facing the camera, though her face was never clear. In the final 3 photographs, she was closer. In one, she stood knee-deep in the river, hands clasped. In the next, her head was slightly tilted, eyes like dark voids where light refused to stay. The last photograph was different. The image was fractured, warped, but through the distortion, the editors could see a reflection in the water. It wasn't Clara's face staring back. It was the widow's. The negatives were sent for further study, but the lab caught fire the same night. The flames spread unnaturally fast, consuming everything. Only one photo survived, the final one, and even that image seemed to fade over time, the woman's outline dissolving into the paper until nothing remained. Clara Hensley was declared missing. Reed Hollow was officially labeled a restricted flood zone, but the photograph still dripped with moisture that no one could explain. By 1937, Reed Hollow was little more than a superstition on old maps, a blank stretch of swamp avoided by hunters and surveyors alike. But that year, engineers began work on a new levee along the Alabama River. They called it Progress. The locals called it a mistake. When the machines arrived, the ground resisted. Equipment broke without reason, and workers swore the mud moved under their boots like breathing skin. A foreman named Willard Price ordered the dredging to continue, and within a week, his crew uncovered something sealed in the earth, 11 glass jars, arranged in a perfect circle. The men joked about it, even posed for a photograph with their find. That night, the camp flooded without rain. The water rose from below, not above, bursting from the soil itself. By morning, the site was gone, swallowed by the returning current of a river no longer on any map. The company abandoned the project, and the government declared the area unsafe for habitation. Locals said the river had taken back its name. Travelers passing through swore they saw a woman standing in the floodlights before the levee broke, her dress rippling though the air was still. Weeks later, the photograph from that crew surfaced. 11 men posed, smiling, muddy, but in the background, the shadow of a 12th figure stood between them, blurred but unmistakable. The caption beneath the image read, "Reed Hollow Works, 1937, before the river rose again." Reed Hollow exists now only in whispers, on maps faded, and in stories told in hushed tones. The land has grown wild, forests reclaiming streets, cypress roots choking what remains of houses. But the memory of the Black Widow lingers. More than memory, a warning etched into the soil, the river, and the air itself. Historians dismiss the events of 1872 as myth or exaggeration. But those who live nearby know better. They speak of black dresses glimpsed through fog, of silver rings bound with thread, of water that moves even on the stillest nights. Some insist the jars are still there, beneath mud and root, waiting for the river to claim what is owed once more. Evelyn Harrow's story is not just a tale of vengeance. It is a mirror held to every sin ever buried in Reed Hollow. The lies, the oaths, the bloodshed done in daylight and darkness alike. Her victims were men, but her legacy is a warning to all who believe they can escape accountability. And the river waits. Patient. Endless. Every so often, a traveler disappears near the bend where the river once broke its banks. Others report the smell of iron and wet earth in the air, the faint hum of a lullaby, and the feeling of eyes watching from black water. The legend says Evelyn Harrow never dies. She simply returns to the river, collecting debts, remembering every throat that has ever been silenced. And Reed Hollow, swallowed by time, will forever bear the mark of the Black Widow.